This is your standard store-bought canvas. It comes pre-stretched and gessoed. And in most applications, this is a great surface to paint on. But if you look at the canvas close up, this is what the texture looks like if I add some graphite to it. It's relatively smooth, but that canvas weave is still clearly visible. And now this is the exact same canvas after I used my technique for smoothing it out. You can see here that the canvas weave is completely removed and the texture is very similar to hot pressed paper. Now, why would you want a canvas as smooth as this to paint on? For me, I switched over from painting from oil paints to painting with acrylics with an airbrush well over a decade ago. And painting with an airbrush is very similar to drawing because you're using a lot of erasing techniques and erasing into the paint. Just like drawing, airbrush painting requires a very smooth surface to work on. And unfortunately, standard canvas with a few layers of gesso that's sanded just has too much texture for what I need. And I love painting on canvas because it's lightweight, it's really tough, and it's easy to roll up for shipping. Paper and panels are a great surface to work on, and I love painting on them, but panels can get heavy and they can also get expensive for large paintings. And paper, even really good paper like cotton or rag paper, is delicate and it requires framing. So if you want to paint on a canvas that's just as smooth as paper or a panel, this is the video for you. I've made 2 of these videos in the past, and I don't know about you guys, but I'm always adjusting and changing my painting techniques. So for 2023, I've updated this technique to address a few things. The best thing is that this version only requires 2 to 3 coats of gesso maximum. You'll be able to get your canvas just as smooth as paper like in the last 2 videos, but in those I used a different gesso and it required a lot more layers, usually around 8 to 10 layers. So this time we're going to be using this stuff. This is super heavy gesso made by Liquitex. And this gesso is incredible for speeding things up because it's very heavy and thick. This viscosity is going to allow me to lay it on much heavier than traditional gesso. Now I still use the other technique that I showed in the last 2 videos, which used normal gesso and about 8 to 10 coats. But if I need to speed things up, I'm going to switch over to the super heavy gesso. So to set up the smooth canvas, I like to do this on my studio floor, and I just put down a drop cloth. In this version, I'll be using a store-bought canvas that already has gesso pre-applied. For my own work, I still make my own canvases, which I stretch myself over MDF or panel. But for this video, I wanted to show that this technique is still possible, even on a budget store-bought canvas. And this canvas is very lightweight and it doesn't give you that much extra canvas to work with. So I'd consider this like a worst case scenario. But even with using this, I could still get a very smooth and nice surface to work on. Because I'm essentially just painting on the gesso, the canvas is only the support structure that holds it. But with that said, I'd always recommend using a heavier canvas just because the gesso is so heavy. I personally use 15-ounce cotton duck canvas for my own work. In order to apply the super heavy gesso to this canvas, the first thing I'm going to do is remove it from the stretcher bars. I'm using one of these cheap staple removers, and I'll just go along the outside of the canvas, removing all the staples. The reason that I'm removing the canvas from the stretcher bars is not to apply the gesso, it's for the final part where I sand it. Stretch canvas is much more difficult to sand. You could still do it, you just have to be careful because it's pretty delicate on the stretcher bars. It's easy to tear into, and if you apply too much pressure, the edges of the stretcher bars could show through, so I don't personally recommend it. This is also the reason that I buy canvas in rolls and stretch it myself, so I don't have to constantly do this. And before I apply this gesso, I just want to say that I'm well aware that there are plenty of other ways to prepare a canvas. Some may agree with my techniques and others won't, and that's just fine. This is just what I like to do and what works best for me, and my hope is that some of you may find this helpful in your own work. So with that disclaimer out of the way, what I'm going to do here is take this canvas and lie it on a flat board. This will give me a flat and smooth surface to work on, and then what I'm going to do is take my stapler and I'll add 2 staples to the end. This step probably isn't all that necessary, but I find that it just helps hold the canvas in place as I apply gesso and then when I sand it. As I said before, I'm going to be using this Liquitex heavy gesso. That way I only need to apply 2, maybe 3 coats max. And just like my last 2 videos, I'm going to also be using a large taping knife. I recommend getting a larger one, at least 12 inches or more, because that way you're not going to have to do as many passes. To evenly coat the canvas, I'm just going to use a small paint roller. Because this gesso is so heavy, I'm removing it from the container using a small joint knife. and I'm basically using this like a spatula, just scooping it out and then applying it to the canvas. I'll try to get this gesso down evenly around the canvas, but the goal here is really just to get that gesso down. Once I have all that gesso down, I'll just switch over to the paint roller and then start evenly spreading it out across the canvas. And you can see right here how different this super heavy gesso is from a traditional gesso. One coat of this stuff feels like 2 or 3 coats of a normal gesso, and that's why this process just goes so much quicker. And once I have this gesso spread out across the canvas with the roller, I'm going to switch over to my taping knife. I'll start on the right side of the canvas and then just use a light amount of pressure to pull the heavy gesso smooth. I can't stress light amount of pressure enough. You're not trying to scrape this stuff off. All you're trying to do is get an even coat of it flat on that canvas. Another nice benefit of this heavy gesso is that it sticks to the blade, so it's really easy to put right back into the container so you don't waste anything. I'll do the second pass overlapping the first pass, using a bit more pressure to the left side so I'm not digging into it with the right side of the taping knife. If you realize that you didn't pull it smooth enough, you could do another 2 passes like I'm doing here. Now, pulling the gesso smooth is very easy to do, but it's a technique that works best after you had some practice. So I'd recommend trying to do this on some cheaper canvases first, just so that you can get the hang of it and build up some muscle memory. If you look at the edge of my taping knife, you'll see here that I rounded off the right corner of it. I ran this edge over a belt sander, and this way it helps prevent that right edge of the taping knife from cutting into the smooth canvas on overlapping passes. And when I pull the gesso smooth, I like to lay the taping knife pretty flat on the surface like what you're seeing here. I found that when it's flat like this, it just does a better job at smoothing it out without removing too much. Because this gesso was laid on so heavily, it's going to take a lot longer to dry than traditional gesso. So after about 2 to 3 hours, it's dry enough to put on a second coat. So I'm going to do this just like I did with the first one. Lay it on with a joint knife or a painting knife, then use a roller to roll it out smooth. And one reason that I stapled the edge of the canvas is that it's just nice that it doesn't move around here as I'm applying the gesso. And now switch back over to the taping knife and apply the same process of smoothing out that gesso. Now you can actually get away with only doing 2 coats here and still get a very smooth canvas. But if you want an ultra smooth canvas like hot pressed paper, I'd recommend letting this coat dry for another 2, maybe 4 hours max, then apply 1 more coat. So that's what I did here. This is the 3rd and final coat. Once I pull this smooth, I'm going to let this dry for about a day, 12 to 24 hours. So the next day, this gesso is dry, but it's not fully cured yet, and this is one of the best times to wet sand it. I like to use distilled water in a spray bottle, and then I'm just going to spray down the left side of this canvas. More water is definitely better than less. I'm essentially soaking down this whole canvas during this point, so it definitely gets kind of messy. If you're thinking to yourself, do I need more or less water? Just add more. For the first part of wet sanding, I'm going to start out this time with 120 grit sandpaper, just wrapped around a sanding block. And I want to make sure that I sand down this entire canvas. If I notice some areas start to dry up, I just add more water to it. Because this gesso isn't fully cured yet, when you wet sand it, it's going to form a slurry. So what I found to be very useful is that once you sanded everything, go back over to the taping knife and then pull off all this excess water. Not only is this going to help remove any of the high points, the slurry is also going to get into some of the lower points and just help smooth it out even more. And if you stop here just by using the 120 grit sandpaper, this will be pretty smooth. But what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to let this dry. This is going to be pretty quick, about a half hour max. And then I'm going to come back to it and sand it again. Before I start sanding it the second time, I'm going to use this small LED light. This is one I have on hand for videos, but any type of light you have is fine. The one on your cell phone will work great, or just an old flashlight. And the reason that I'm using this is to spot treat any areas that have a bit more texture than the rest. I'll just work my way around the whole canvas, look for some areas that are raised up or a little bit too low. Then I'll put some water on it and just sand that small area smooth. It's tough to see in this video, so I set up another shot here in a dark room, just with the same light over to the side. And here's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. This area definitely needs some more work. So I added some water to a paper towel, and I'm just rubbing over this area just to get it damp. Then I'm going to go back over to my sandpaper. This time I'm switching it up to 220 grit, so it's going to be a little bit smoother, so I could use some more pressure to sand into this. And then for any other area around the canvas that needs some extra work, I'll do the same thing. Another way that you can go about this is just use a light pencil, like I'm using a 2H here, and just circle the areas that need some extra work. And then when I wet the entire canvas with some distilled water again, I'll still be able to see those circles. So as I'm sanding this with the 220 grit sandpaper, I can focus some more attention on these areas that need some more sanding. That way I can get everything nice and smooth. So once I have that water down, I just sanded the entire canvas here. It's pretty quick to do. It only takes maybe 5 minutes at the most. Then back over to the taping knife and remove the excess slurry. And then that's it. This canvas is done. If you want to be safe and just check everything, go back over to your light and just go around the canvas one more time. If you see any bumps, you could just sand it again. But as I'm checking this here, this is perfectly smooth, just like a piece of paper. And from here, all I need to do is re-stretch it. So I'll take these staples out, remove it off this board, and add it back to the stretcher bars. I'm going to speed through this because everyone has a different way of stretching their canvas, but I just use a pair of canvas pliers to pull it tight and then a staple gun to staple it in. So after I finish, the edge looks like this, and ideally you want a canvas where it actually wraps around the back so you don't have to see the staples, but that's the way this one was, so I made it work. And then once it's fully stretched, that's it for this one, and you're ready to start painting if you like working on a stretched canvas. If you want to paint on a very stable canvas where it doesn't have any give or flex, I recommend checking out the video that I'm linking up above in the right corner. That's the last tutorial on getting a smooth canvas. And in that one, I wrap it around a piece of MDF. That way it's stable to work on. Once that's done, I'll remove it and add it to some stretcher bars. And finally, this is what the canvas looks like before. I'm shining a light on it from the right side so you could see the texture. And this is what it looks like after. It definitely takes some time and patience to get this canvas looking right, but for me anyway, it's well worth the effort and it's undoubtedly my favorite surface to paint on. So I do hope that this helps some of you guys out there. Thank you so much for watching. And speaking of help, I want to thank these generous channel members who help support this channel. Your support as channel members truly keeps this channel going, so thank you.